Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we have to talk about the cross section between free speech and cybersecurity, and that's human rights. And something is going on in the United Nations right now in terms of a proposed bill that may actually throw that out of whack. And this is actually really interesting, and I've got a lot of thoughts on this, but here's what's going on. This is coming from Cyberscoop. Now, human rights advocates are warning that basically a proposal at the United Nations to counter cybercrime could actually validate tactics that autocratic governments around the world are using to criminalize free speech and security research. Now, here's what's going on. Both the governments of China and Russia are backing essentially the establishment of a new anti-cybercrime convention, a process that diplomats at the United Nations will begin considering next week. However, the wording of the proposal, which calls for the curbing of the use of technologies for criminal purposes, quote unquote, is vague to the point of potentially enabling government repression of its citizens, according to critics. Now, here's what's going on. A report that was issued today by Human Rights Watch, which is a New York-based advocacy group, details a growing list of so-called cybercrime laws that governments around the world have allegedly used to target dissenters to that government or infringe on personal privacy. And some of the examples they give is a law in Pakistan that enables their authorities to block websites that are used to criticize government officials. In the Philippines, police can collect computer data without a warrant under their Cybercrime Prevention Act. A judge there used actually that same law to convict a journalist, Maria Ressa, of libel last year, and now Ms. Ressa now faces up to 6 years in prison in that country. Now, this proposal, backed by Russia and China, quote, risks legitimizing, end quote, such abusive practices and making the internet less open and secure, according to the Human Rights Watch statement. Quote, instead of a treaty, governments should prioritize reforming these abusive laws to conform with international human rights standards. Now, the proposal is actually a counterweight to an anti-cybercrime agreement known as the Budapest Convention that 64 nations, including the United States, signed in 2001, Budapest being the capital of Hungary. And to basically quote Christopher Painter, basically he's the former top official at the State Department, focus on cyber diplomacy, and I quote, this has been one of the main reasons the US and others have been skeptical of Russia's resolution and this process, that it really is a platform to advance measures trying to restrict content, including political speech, rather than addressing computer crime. Now, this proposal is also part of a broader effort by the Russian government to shape global cybersecurity norms that the United States and its allies continuously accuse Moscow of violating. So, for example, the State Department has successfully encouraged other governments to denounce alleged Russian hacking operations in unison, and multiple European governments now blame Russia last year for disrupting government websites in the country of Georgia, a former state of the Soviet Union. Several U.S. allies as well, including Australia and New Zealand, have also expressed support for the U.S. statement on Russia's alleged exploitation of software made by SolarWinds. I've done a ton of videos and podcasts on that, and the White House itself argued that Russian activity exceeded international spying norms because it placed an undue burden on private companies whose products were exploited. Now, the struggle for geopolitical influence at the United Nations comes as the new Biden administration has pledged to make human rights central to its approach, basically for cybersecurity and cyberspace in general. And so that's obviously a huge, huge thing. Now, basically, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas said in March, and I quote, far too often cybersecurity is used as a pretext to infringe on civil liberties and human rights. At the end of the day, cybersecurity is about people. It is about protecting our way of life and protecting what we hold dear. And I think this is actually very interesting because I think a lot of critics, here in the United States of this that would support this bill through the United Nations could point to the recent banning of now former President Trump from Twitter and Facebook as a violation of his free speech, even though these are private companies that essentially can do what they want. This is not a violation of the First Amendment for them to do that because the former president can still speak. He just recently actually spun up a blog called, I think it's like the Desk of President Donald J. Trump or something like that, where he can make his thoughts known, and that's not being blocked at all. He can do that or wherever he wants on any platform that chooses to accept him. In this case, Facebook and Twitter do not. But I think this is actually really interesting because under the pretext of crime, and even outside of cybercrime, we have a history in multiple nations that is replete of essentially accusing a citizen of a crime and being able to detain them or violate their rights without really any evidence, or let's say getting a court of law to sign off on that in any real free and open and legal way or balanced. And so if we are using the guise of cybercrime or cybersecurity at the state level as a tool to essentially oppress free speech. So for example, if I criticize my government and the government basically orders my accounts to be banned because I am critical of my government, that is a suppression of human rights. And we see that globally. And what makes this really interesting is, and I think the task the United Nations has, and it's a huge lift that the United Nations has to do, and I understand they get a lot of criticism because they're non-binding and all of these other things, is that essentially what they're trying to do is bring together governments and societies that have a different outlook or a different position on what essentially is human rights and the limits of human rights, assuming there are any. So I think this is a really interesting topic. This is going to be heavily debated, but if this passes, for example, through the United Nations, to the point of human rights, the Human Rights Watch organization, we may actually see authoritarian governments go ahead and say, aha, now we have something that we can charge cybercrime with and arbitrarily start doing it based on the interests of the state as opposed to the human rights or the interests of the people. And I think that's something that we really need to discuss. So that's your news of the day. I found this absolutely interesting. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this from wherever you are from around the world, as I know I've got listeners and followers and watchers and all of that, all over. I'd love to know what you think your government thinks about this and what we're going to do. But that is your news of the day. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. Thanks, everyone.